Okay, in the interest of remaining on schedule, I'd like to get us all to wrap up the table conversations and start the proceedings again here. So I hope you enjoyed the morning's invited presentation, and those of you who went on the tour, I hope you enjoyed the tour. We had some really interesting stuff right at the end of the tour as we were all trying to stave off starvation. So this afternoon we're going to have a series of report outs from a variety of committees, followed by a UCAID pilot project presentation, and then we are going to have a break. Troop ID will be sponsoring the coffee on our break this afternoon. Thank you very much to Troop ID for sponsoring a break. And we will then have committee breakouts for the remainder of the afternoon, and the chairs will once again meet at the end of the day. Any questions or comments about agenda or anything else before I hand over to the first of our report outs? Seeing none. Adam Madlin, who is the chair of the Security Committee, is going to give us an update on the taxonomy ad hoc group, and he has a proposal to make to the plenary about how we are going to continue to carry out the taxonomy work. He has 45 minutes, give or take a few. Adam.
Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Madlin. I'm with Symantec. Wynn Bayless and I are going to give an update on the progress we've made in the taxonomy ad hoc group. And before I jump in, just to give a tiny bit of background and say a few things, this taxonomy ad hoc group is sponsored by both the Standards Committee and the Security Committees, and it spun off from those committees, but has been open to any attendees. This effort first got underway sometime in the fall, but really started to pick up steam in the spring time frame. I jumped in and started facilitating the process in May. And as part of that restart a little bit, we evaluated what we're doing and how we're doing it. And since then, we've really started to make some good progress, and I think we found our stride. And as a result, we're very excited to be able to share with you some of the work we're doing. So here's what I'm going to cover. We have 45 minutes allotted. We prepared about 30 minutes of presentation. We'd like to hold questions to the end. Not sure if we're going to get a lot of questions or very little questions, but if you can allow Wynn and I to complete our presentation, and then we can entertain any questions on anything related to taxonomy work we're doing. So first I'm going to go over the objectives of the group and what we're trying to accomplish, then discuss the process and approach that we've employed and the roles we've identified to complete the work. Then I'm going to hand it over to Wynn, who's going to go over the current terms that we've completed and are in process, and then describe or lay out the next steps that we're going to be undertaking. We had a meeting this morning and continued some good progress. Then I'm going to come back and discuss our recommendation, the ad hoc group's recommendation for how this IDESG glossary that we're creating will get used. And then finally, as Bob said, the group has a proposal that we'd like to share with the plenary, and I'll get into that at that point. So the objectives of the taxonomy ad hoc group, and it is an ad hoc group sponsored by the two committees, as I said, so it is not a chartered group, and that's a somewhat important element, we believe. So our objective is to create a common language for the identity ecosystem. And as part of that, we're going to develop an official glossary to be adopted and used for all internal and external deliverables and activities. At least that's our objective. The approach we used is shown here. 5 key phases: identify the terms, define the terms, attempt through driving to consensus within the ad hoc group, then having the committees, both the Standard and Security Committee, review it and approve it, or provide feedback for additional work that might be needed, and then finally submit it to the plenary for, as I said, hopefully to be used across all the work products of the plenary. To get a little bit more specific, some of the key parts of this approach are, we've decided that we need to pursue terms in sets, in groups, terms that have, dependencies and interrelations. And so you can't just take one term at a time and then be done with it. So we've had to define a set of groups of terms, and that as we get through one, we're continually going back to terms until we have the full set complete. It's a fairly iterative process. Another important point is that we, like most of the other work or the rest of the work of the IDESG, we're not trying to create things from scratch. So we're trying to leverage other sources, other references, all relevant references that are available, and have a solid starting point, and then focus on what we want to do for the IDESG. And then, we've had some very lively discussions, deliberations. I meant to mention, it's quite an active ad hoc group. There's a lot of participation, a lot of energy around it. That's great. Very excited about that. And so, we always have some very lively and interesting conversations. And we have been able to sort of just through the workings of the group and through some effective facilitation, allow people to, share all their insights and inputs and work through them while at the same time completing some work. And that's an important point, because early on we were just going round and round and round with a lot of the definitions that we were working on. So it comes to a point where you have to just try and bring closure to it and sort of force through that process at times. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the approval processes later in the presentation. So as part of the process that we deployed, we had to formally identify some roles so we can accomplish the work. I've been facilitating this since May and will continue to do so for the time being. Eventually, hopefully, maybe be able to get others to join in. Win Bayless is our project editor, and he's done some great contributions around setting the stage for all of the deliberations, scouring the different sources and making them available to the team to go over and then to allow us to work through the process. I also want to say that the MPO has provided assistance to help coordinate and facilitate, and where they could, some manpower to simplify certain aspects, and that's been very, very helpful. We have finally got the wiki up to date. We have a wiki page. I think it's called the Taxonomy Ad Hoc Catalog now, and so I encourage everybody to go to it to see the latest status of the work that we've accomplished. It is available and accessible, and people can contribute. And Scott Shorter has volunteered to be our wiki editor, and for a long while it languished as far as keeping up with the work we were accomplishing. But it is up to date, and we intend on now on a weekly basis to keep it up to date. Finally, all the different participants, and there's been a fairly large number of them, having a very important role, and have always come with the right attitude about doing the right thing for the IDESG and working together and collaborating and cooperating, and that's also been great. And then the Standards Committee is in essence the sponsor of this deliverable as it is in their charter, and we feel it's important that any deliverables coming out of an ad hoc group, ours in this case, has the approval and or sponsorship of a chartered committee, and I will come back to that in a moment. The Security Committee will be also reviewing the deliverables and working through things. So I think I now hand it off to Wynn to go over the work that we've accomplished, and then I'll come back.
Thank you, Adam. We have looked at a lot of terms a lot of definitions, and we have come to agreement on some of those. We call those the completed definitions. That means that we've had a chance to agree, disagree, and finally come to a consensus on the definitions for these four terms: attribute, authentication, identity, and token. And so attribute has been completed. The definition is a named quality or characteristic that is claimed to be inherent in or ascribed to someone or something. And the source material for that definition was a NIST 800-63-1 document adapted from that. Authentication has also been completed, and that definition is a process of verification of an attribute or a set of attributes in order to obtain statistically acceptable assurance in a claimed identity. And that also was adapted from NIST SP 800-63-1. Identity was a tough one, but we have completed that. Identity is a set of attributes that uniquely distinguishes an entity in context, and that's a key word, in context. And that was adapted from both the SP 800-63 and an ITU document. Lastly, token. Everyone thinks they know what a token is. Here's the definition of the token: something that the claimant possesses and controls that is used to authenticate the claimant's identity. And that was adapted from SP 800-63. So those are our four finished. They're not approved, but they're out there, and they will be available on the wiki site. We had one other definition that we couldn't quite come to terms with, and that's credential. We'll come to that shortly. And other terms to be finalized in our next set is authority, and we're actually going to postpone the discussion on that and then replace it with some specific examples. Applicant is next. Entity has been discussed in some detail. We finally came to terms with that this morning. Claimant, sponsor, and subscriber are additional terms we're working on. And if we have any luck, we'll have definitions for those by the next meeting in Gaithersburg. So the applicant proposal is an identity undergoing the processes of registration, enrollment, and identity proofing. You probably want to look at sponsor also, because that relates to this, and that's a NIST SP 800 source. Claimant is an entity whose identity is to be verified using an authentication protocol, and that was adapted from SP 800 in an ITU document also. Credential is now an object or data structure that binds to a claimed, that's not the latest definition.
What you have, I thought we had the updated version in here. Yeah. Probably my mistake.
So which is it?
Oh no, this is right. This is right.
I'm looking at the monitor. Let's see if that. Attributes presented as evidence of a claim identity. Good. And now we have entity. And that is a thing that exists, e.g. a person, organization, device, software application, or service. And that was adapted from SP 800. Sponsor, which is proposed, is a human performing enrollment processes on behalf of a non-person entity, and that's also adopted from SP 800. And subscriber is an entity who has received a credential from a credential service provider, CSP, and that's adapted from SP 800, that's 63. There are 5 additional sets of terms. Adam, you want to take this? And attribute is one of the major discussion items we've had for some time, including today. And so in our next set, there's attribute name and attribute value, identifier, pseudonymous identifier, and named identifier. And in the next set, there are about 6 more terms. And the 5th set deals with logical token and physical token. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. We'd be delighted to have your input. We have a lot of input already. It's a very active group. And at the end, we do reach consensus, but it isn't easy. It's a very, very difficult task.
One additional point, if you've noticed, on each of the headers, titles, we have the term proposed or completed. And I just want to point out, I think it's important to point out what it is we mean. We are proposing these terms to be part of the IDESG glossary and are the agreed upon terms to be used across the IDESG. Completed means it's been completed and consensus developed within the ad hoc group. We are going to then go through the approval process. It doesn't mean that any of these completed terms cannot ever change. We do see this. You know, a lot of these terms can have multiple meanings, and we've made a very significant effort to come up with a single definition. We felt that was important, and I'll comment on the use of these and related terms in a moment, but I just want to make the point that it is entirely possible that these terms can get revisited, and as potentially committees come up with different use cases or purposes that a term that we've already agreed upon might not meet, we will continue to evaluate adjustments that might be needed or additions. And in addition, for example, terms like entity or maybe better is identity, you know, there's multiple different types of identity. We felt it's important to define the overarching identity and then first and have it encompass all the other known types of identities, digital identity, that we will be working on. So that's a somewhat important aspect of how we pursued this work. So moving on, the recommendation is we are going to start the process of submitting these terms, working through the approval processes very shortly after the plenary. And we want to submit a recommendation to the plenary on how they are used. And we talked through this, spent a fair amount of time discussing this, and certainly it's open to broader conversation, but we feel pretty strongly that this is the appropriate usage of the IDESG glossary. So, it will be the common language for the IDESG. It should be used for all internal deliverables. We also feel that it will be that'll be important to be recognized as our official definitions and used for external interactions to have a common language, to be able to communicate effectively with external parties. For the official definitions, the glossary this glossary should represent the core definition of each term. And any documentation, any place it's used, should utilize the core definition unless you specify otherwise. Now, recommendations for extensions are certainly possible, but they shouldn't change the core definition that we've determined. So a lot of work is going in the ad hoc group, and anybody that has not been participating but has an interest, we'd really welcome that. And then finally, it's also we believe that it'll be very helpful to have it used as external interactions, and that could be very, very beneficial. So as we were going through this, we realized a couple of things that I referenced earlier on. We're an ad hoc group. We're not chartered, so we don't have set rules that we necessarily have to follow other than the rules of association. So we determined that there is not an agreed upon process to enable the adoption of deliverables from an ad hoc group, but even from committees to the plenary. So we want to start the process of proposing a process for plenary adoption of deliverables coming out of either a committee or an ad hoc group. And here's our proposal. All proposals should be made with the approval of a chartered committee. We are doing that with both the Standard Committee and the Security Committee in this case. Now, formally how it's submitted, that can vary, but we don't believe it needs to be submitted by the committee, but it should have the committee's approval. We certainly want to utilize the privacy evaluation process and run any deliverables by the Privacy Committee and allow them to determine if they need to do an approval of any work products. We will support and want to support that any deliverables are published in an effective way that allows transparency and allows people to review it with the proper time and access and ability to interact on that. So we need to somewhat formalize the publishing process around potential, at a minimum, the timing of how long something should be made available before it goes up for a vote. And then possibly the most important point of this proposal from the taxonomy group is that we welcome discussion about the terms, but we don't believe it's appropriate to revisit the full definitions and entertain changes within the broader plenary. That's an important point. So what we would like to suggest is that there is a vote, an up or down vote for these terms, and if there is a no vote on the terms, that explanations are provided so they can be worked out in the ad hoc group. So that's the essence of the proposal, and we're going to determine the right process, if there's a process, Bob, to put this in place.
So is this on?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the audience online can hear me. So this is largely consistent with what's written in, I believe it's, Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, Special Rule of Order number 1 for decision making. I should note that by default we try, if possible, not to vote. We try to proceed by consensus. And the first time a submission comes before the plenary, it comes under the rule that no vote is possible, and until and unless it doesn't survive a consensus determination and is sent back by the plenary for more work. But I think this is very much in the spirit of that rule. We certainly don't want to get into doing editing of the text of our documents in real time in the full plenary meeting. What we want to do is we want to allow the committees and the subcommittees and ad hoc groups to do their work. We then want to bring them before the plenary, and the two-phase mechanism that we have in our Special Rule of Order is designed to do exactly what Adam proposes. It's designed to allow the plenary to say, well, this is proceeding, but maybe it's not exactly right yet, and we have a conversation, and people identify a set of issues, which are, I think, what you're talking about in terms of comments. And of course, in a plenary, in a consensus determination, it wouldn't be a no vote, but nevertheless an objection, which is what happens in consensus discussions, should be backed up by a communication to the authoring body about what actions would be desirable to overcome the objection. So I think this largely is the procedure which is already enshrined in the rules of association on if there is a vote and so we get to the second round of our deliberations. I guess what I'd say is that it probably isn't necessary for people to file a no vote with a comment during the vote, because if there are only 2 or 3 no votes and the proposal passes, then there's no additional work to be done. But if the proposal is in fact defeated, I would then assume that a discussion would take place amongst the people who voted no, and that they would send in comments describing the reasons for the vote and how to move forward. So I think that's my read on how the proposal accords with what is currently in the Rules of Association. I think now it's up to y'all to discuss and give Adam feedback either on the taxonomy and glossary activity or for, in very limited cases, on specifics of taxonomy and glossary items, or on the procedure generally. And we have a question down here. But wait until I reach you with the microphone so that the online audience will be able
to take questions on any aspect of the presentation as well. Sir.
Hi, Adam. Jim Zock for those on the line. Adam, this is a tough thing to do, and I appreciate the toughness of it. And there's just comments on a couple of things you've said as food for thought, if nothing else at this stage, appreciating the work that's been done. As you know, the ABA tried a couple of years ago to do a taxonomy, and we wound up with a matrix that was pretty exhaustive and difficult to deal with. But what it did also talk to us about was context, and you mentioned that word yourself, where a single definition or a single term is used in multiple ways by the same organization depending on the context of its use or the use case from which it emanated. So I would be very careful about being absolute about definitions, particularly from a single source, since most of those seem to be from a single source. But there's probably 20 glossaries that are in common use right now, and it's tough to synthesize them. But I would think that there's 2 things I would ask for before this comes. Again, from looking at earlier efforts, one of those is a synonyms kind of directory, where a term "see also" or also used as, because that will help with some of the context discussions, I think, over time. And just a caution to look at those things and be more inclusive rather than less inclusive and absolute.
Great feedback. We appreciate it. Sort of related to that, we've also had some conversations around identifying relationships between the terms as part of the glossary. And we know that could fall a couple places. So it's good input. We're noting it down, and we'll take that into account.
In Bob's description, I'm sorry, this is David Rosenberg. In Bob's addressing the proposal to the plenary slide, he said, I believe, that it was largely in line, but not quite in line, because the plenary procedure preferred consensus if possible. In view of that, does the ad hoc committee still want to press this, or is the ad hoc committee willing to accept the procedure as Bob described it?
I'm pretty sure I can speak for the group on that, and we'd certainly be willing to make a go with the first set of terms, because there's some belief that we might have to adjust and learn as we go. So my thought is that if that we follow the spirit of what we're trying to do around transparency and consensus, we can certainly pursue as Bob described it, and see if it works, because this is we are going to submit it in chunks. We want to start submitting the work product and get it in place so people can use it, and other work might be able to proceed. So we're going to have multiple opportunities to go through this process.
So, Adam, I'll be happy to help you edit this so that it conforms with the special rule of order number 1, and you can take it back to the committee, and we'll see whether there's any heartburn about that.
Stuart Shapiro. I appreciate the work that you've been putting into this, but I must confess I'm a little concerned about how it seems some of the definitions that you put on the table seem very hung up on quote-unquote identity. And that may sound like a very bizarre complaint, given that this is the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group. But part of the vision of NSTIC was, or is, a recognition that there are lots of use cases where identity is essentially irrelevant. What matters is that you can prove to some level of assurance that you have a certain attribute or you have a certain credential, and who you are per se doesn't matter. And yet the definitions seem very focused in a number of them on identity. Just to take an example, authentication, where you talk about authenticating an identity. But if all I have to do is prove that I have a certain attribute, the authentication is simply authenticating that that attribute belongs to me, the claimant, and my identity has nothing to do with it.
Is your question or point related to the definition we've completed, or that there's additional terms that need to be added to the process?
Well, my concern is a trend that I saw in some of the completed definitions, which seem to me overly narrow in their focus on quote-unquote identity.
We did take an approach that to try and, as we finalize terms, allow them to be, we started with broad terms and allow them to be all-encompassing, and as we pursued the process, quickly realized that there's a lot of qualifying and related terms that we will need to pursue to better be able to communicate some of the elements of the IDESG. So I'm thinking we're encompassing a lot, in the end result, and this is a long-term process, we will encompass a lot of the concerns that you raise. My only other thought is that you join us and raise some of your concerns, because that's the work is in the in the ad hoc group, and we feel that, I think everybody agrees, we've got to allow the committees to do their work. And we have a broad cross-section and really have strived to take into account everybody's views. So if there are some perspectives we're missing, the only way to work through that is to, get a broader set, and we want to do that. So participation.
So I was fixing to put Stuart on half of that spot, and just ask whether you could write up that particular comment and send it to the working group.
I'm happy to send them something in writing.
Great, thank you. There's a taxonomy listserv, and so it's just taxonomy work. Oh. And I should have said that there's a taxonomy listserv. If anybody wants to track the work, there is regular dialogues offline, out of our regular weekly meetings that occur there, and that could be another avenue for people to contribute.
Peter Brown next.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Adam.
Hello.
Firstly, I want to say thank you for all the work that's been done on this. I mean, I followed, as many of us have, the exchanges online, which have been from the sort of deeply philosophical to amusing, but ultimately useful. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying to get towards. My comment is, what you're proposing is essentially a toolkit for the use of language within our work. It's not a policy pronouncement of IDESG towards the outside world. Therefore, I would wonder whether we can push the boat out a bit further on this issue of procedure, and even suggest that, given that it's in the power of the plenary as the sovereign body to give as well as take away, give and delegate authority to groups and take it away from them if they're not behaving, given that, to be frank, a plenary discussion on any individual term and the definitions is probably not going to be as constructive and useful ultimately as having that work being done, that deep dive being done by a group of specialists in a very public space where anybody can participate, and those who have something to say do participate. I would even go as far as saying that we as plenary should trust to this group to get on with the work of defining the core terms that serve us as a community as a set of tools. They're not a pronouncement of policy, they're a set of tools. And if we feel that if any of those tools are rusty or need repairing, then indeed we give the signals, like Stuart's just done, that this tool isn't working, we need it refined a little bit in order that we're having the conversations we need. Because ultimately, what you're doing is, I say nothing more than, that's not to belittle the work, but it's nothing more than a tool set for us to be able to develop policy documents which say, when we use the word X, we're using it in this way as defined here, and to be understood in that context. And I'm a little bit worried of this sort of, let's say, this sort of purist Madisonian principle that everything has to come back to the plenary because we don't trust each other at the end of the day. And that if we're talking about building online trust, we could start by doing a bit of delegation from plenary and saying, you're doing great work, guys. You're more or less on the right road. You'll get some feedback when you're doing things wrong, and we'll tell you when to sharpen the tools up when necessary. But just get on with it and let other people use the work that you're doing in their policy development and use that as the basis of going on forward.
So, in the interest of staying on schedule, I'm going to have two more. I'm going to have Adam respond to that, and then I'm going to take two more questions, one from Kenny and one from Tony, and then after that, we will move on to the next speaker. However, you are, of course, welcome to contact Adam electronically or in person during the week to follow up with additional questions. Kenny. Adam
the
first
very
to
brief
respond.
feedback I might have to Peter is I would absolutely support that, and maybe one way to build trust amongst the plenary is to have more people just join in, even for a short period of time, and witness some of the work we're doing. We have what we believe is a good process. We have it's very democratic and a lot of participation, and amongst a lot of not shy people. So you can potentially build your own trust level in the work that we're doing and the quality of the work. There's always a chance there's things we're going to miss, and open to suggestions. And that's why we feel it's important to make the point that none of this work is set in stone, that we're going to continue to evaluate it and grow it as appropriate, and run it against use cases, run it against needs of the different committees to make sure they're meeting the overall IDESG objectives.
So very quickly, Stu, your concern, I surmise, would be coming from the ability of those terms being able to apply to anonymous, pseudonymous cases and so on. However, I just give two analogies. One is protocols could have a complete set of data fields. Some of them could be null because of the use case. More commonplace analogies, a system that needs to be run and operated by somebody needs to generate invoice, even though the invoice is addressed to XYZ or to whom it may concern or anonymous person. But it doesn't remove the need for the machine to generate an invoice. So I think that analogy should point out that as the terminologies gets applied into system design and encountering use cases of anonymous or pseudonymous, you can have those, totally frivolous buffer, the data fillers. That means nothing. That would preserve the concern about privacy and anomalous use and so on. But it doesn't remove the need to generate that invoice, which is empty.
So I guess we're going to wrap up here. I just have one
we
final.
We have one more question from Tony. Although that was a nice try.
Hi, Tony.
So the term identity as defined, I think, is correct. So I'd go back to Stuart and say he should reread the definition of identity, because it never says that this is a set of attributes, right? And so it just uniquely distinguishes. Uniquely distinguishes can be anything. It could be a shoe size. It could be anything else that resides there. So everybody is uniquely distinguishable, whether you know their name, whether you know anything. They all have distinguishing attributes about themselves. So I think the way we did the definition, it doesn't reveal anything.
So this is the type of discussions we had to try and really flush them out and try and address all the different perspectives. So we welcome more input. I guess to wrap up, I just want to thank all the individuals that have been putting a lot of time into this taxonomy work. Sorry I can't mention your names, but there's a pretty large group of individuals who really have committed and put a lot of effort into it. And I just want to thank everybody for all the good work we've done. And we really do feel like we're on on a little bit of a roll, and we're going to continue pushing on a weekly basis. And please join us. Please join us. Taxonomy, it's on the calendar and on the listserv. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. And nobody loves a lexicographer, so you're doing, probably better than average in this respect. It's a lot of hard work, and we appreciate it. And definitely, those of you who do have concerns, I think, it's a good idea to, to get involved in the conversation. So next up, we have Kathy Tilton, who is going to take us through a similar discussion of the methodology that the Standards Committee, in collaboration with other committees, is using to work on our use cases. So Kathy, go ahead and take it away.
Okay. Is there? Yep, up there is. Thank you. So many of you may have remembered that we did some work at the use case workshop in May, and I thought you might be interested in an update on what we're doing, and I have a specific area I wanted to bring you up to speed on too. So I'm going to just give you a quick recap and then talk about several specific things. But to just remind you why we're doing use cases, we see these as forming the basis for the development of other work products in and across the IDESG, providing context for those work products. It's also a method of eliciting requirements, helps us define the problem we're trying to solve, and also determine some commonalities as we go forward to design services. And in general, it's just guiding our collective efforts, keeping us better aligned, allowing us to, for each of our work products, test it against the set of use cases that have been defined. So where are we right now? Up until this point, we have set up a use case ad hoc group. It's established. It is active. Even though it's sponsored by the Standards Committee, we've made multiple invitations to all the other committees to send representatives to participate in the use case ad hoc group, and many of you have taken advantage of that opportunity. We do have the wiki launched, and that's our mechanism for collecting use cases, and then we held the workshop at the May plenary. At that plenary, we got some feedback from you all. There was more feedback than this. This is my summary. Use cases are too implementation specific. So we had picked some set of contributed use cases to use as examples during the workshop. The major feedback we got on those was that they needed to be abstracted and generalized. The use cases on the wiki should be tagged to indicate their status. Right now, there's use cases out there. Some of them are very well developed. Some of them are really nothing more than just a name at this point. But in order to aid people in looking at them, it was thought that if we could know what stage they were in their development, it would be helpful. And also, the overall use case process is not well defined. So in terms of activities and status, we have, since that time, set up a use case listserv and file depot, so you can go out and find all of our materials out there. You can participate in the discussions on use cases. We do continue to collect and refine use cases, and we have drafted a use case life cycle, which I'm going to show you in a second. We have sent this out on July 19th for formal committee review, and we're soliciting comments on that draft use case lifecycle, as well as the criteria, use case criteria, and the use case template. So we've asked for comments by August 6th. We're hoping to stick to that date, but right now that's the date. So in terms of defining the use case lifecycle in terms of stages, we just basically defined a 6-stage lifecycle. As we mentioned at one point before, the intent is similar to what's being done in the terminology group, where we're defining an initial set of use cases, but that doesn't mean that is the only set of use cases. We do want to publish a set, but we're continuing to collect them and add to that set over time. So it is going to be a continuous process. Don't expect you to read this, but this is the proposed use case life cycle. It does take it through those 6 stages. I mostly wanted to just introduce you to the fact that we've done this, that it is out for review and comment. All this stuff is posted on the use case file depot, and so we're actively looking for your feedback on the process. We think that this process will be useful for efforts besides the use case cases themselves. The only thing I really wanted to point out on this particular slide is there's a section here for committee review. So it goes from the individual contributor to the use case ad hoc group, which hopefully has representation from all the committees already. But then there's a step where the committees take these use cases and review and comment on them. So that includes the privacy committee. And so what we're really hoping is that by seeing this stuff at this stage, when we get to the approval stage where there's a formal sign-off by the privacy committee, they will have already seen it and have had an opportunity to contribute to it, and hopefully it'll be in good enough shape that we don't have any major problems by the time we get there. So anyway, then there's the committee approval, the plenary approval, and publication. And this just breaks it down into kind of a process flow through those different stages to where it enters the formal ROA approval process. So as I mentioned, I think that by trying to define this life cycle, we're hoping that this model can be adapted for use with other cross-committee activities, such as the terminology/taxonomy. And if you were paying attention when Adam put up his slides, you probably saw something that looks suspiciously like the life cycle chart that I just showed you, and so that's an example of how that could be utilized. We see this as possibly, we're looking at it now as we're putting together our standards adoption process. There's a number of these things that cross committee lines. So we're hoping that if we get this one right, it could have value beyond its original purpose. And we're looking for you guys to help us get it right. The next thing is the criteria. Hopefully you have seen this criteria already. It's been sent out. We did use it during the workshop. But the idea for the criteria is that we'll provide guidance to the use case developers and submitters to improve the overall quality of the use cases. Also be able to apply that for the selection for intermediate uses, and eventually if I go back to that use case life cycle, there's one of the things that it defines is a progression gate. How does it go from here to here and from here to here? And some of those have to do with applying the criteria at certain points in that process. So the criteria itself, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through. You've seen it before. It's out for review now. Please do take a look at it and let us know if we're missing anything. We have defined two kind of parts to the use case criteria. One is the individual use case criteria, where this criteria is applied to a standalone use case. And then there's a use case set criteria. So what we're doing is similar to what you heard from Adam on the taxonomy, is we'll be putting together a set of use cases that will progress to publication. And so as we're selecting that set, we want to apply primarily a diversity criteria. And then the template, we're trying to get this use cases in a common format for publication so that, as people are reading them, they have commonality on how they're structured and they can understand them a little bit better. They're more consistent. We're ensuring completeness. As input, we'll accept it in any format. But eventually, as it goes through that life cycle process, it needs to be converted into a common format for publication. Again, I'm not going to go through the details of the template. Scott did that for you last time. But please look at it, see what you think. There is a use case wiki out there where you can actually look at some of the use cases that have been put into this format, and that might also help you in trying to review the template itself. So one question I have is the stuff that I just showed you, the life cycle, the criteria, the template. These are not formal IDESG work products. The set of use cases themselves are a formal IDESG work product, but these things that we're asking you to review and comment are not. They're kind of intermediate level tools that we're going to use in the process of creating that formal work product. So the question I had is, who votes on these? That this is now our criteria, this is our life cycle, this is our template. The default answer I put down is the SEC does. It's responsible ultimately for the work product. But is that the right answer? Perhaps, I know Bob was talking earlier about a consensus process within the plenary. I'm not sure what the right answer is.
Is that it?
No.
Okay.
But do you want me to just go on?
Yes, you should go on, and we'll do questions at the end.
Okay. So our fearless leader, Mr. Blakely, has set for us a goal, which we had we agree with, and that is to publish a set of IDESG use cases by the end of 2013, which will accomplish the following goals. Bob sent out an email, I think, last week that set these out, and all I've done really is just cut and pasted them into a slide so that you could be familiar with where we're trying to go. We're looking at a set of around plus or minus 10 use cases. We're trying to make them as general as possible, as diverse as possible, to cover all of the functional areas of a identity lifecycle, so that we don't have 10 use cases that are pretty much identical, other than in a few details here and there. We're looking to try to make them broad so that when they become available to the committees for use, they will be useful. So is Scott here? Hi, Scott. Did you want to come up and talk about this part? Or did you want me to just plow through? Okay. So this is kind of what I was saying. We're trying to select a small set. They're on the wiki to represent a diverse set of, that's kind of what I already said, right? And we want to work on them to ensure that the implementation specific details are removed per the feedback that we got. We're taking out the requirements entry. We feel like this is more of an analysis phase element. The template is complete, consistently applied, and the terminology is aligned to the extent possible. So that's what we've been doing in the ad hoc group, working through the set of use cases. And we selected them based on their relevance, the detail that they have, the diversity, and from a practical standpoint, there's a contributor that's active and available to work with us on it. So our approach is to identify the set of use cases, group them into sets or phases to develop and finalize. And once selected, we're just meeting on a weekly basis to try to review and finalize these. And we're doing it in a structured process where we have written comments on each of the use cases that are available ahead of time, and then we're working through and disposing of those comments. We have set roles for the different participants. The ad hoc group is chaired by Scott. So he made the initial proposal of the set that was discussed and consensus achieved on that, working with us to update them and gather and resolve comments, provide meeting reports, all that kind of good stuff. We have the ad hoc participants that are reviewing, commenting on the use cases, and participating in those discussions. The submitter that we're trying to coordinate with as well, and then the standards committee is the ultimate sponsor of the work. So I'm not going to go through these use cases now. These are the ones that we're working on. They're out on the wiki. Feel free to take a look at them. And we have a schedule that needs to be updated because we were very optimistic at first that we thought, we should be able to get through 2 of these use cases a week. No. We're lucky to get through reviewing 1 use case a week. And so our goal is by the October plenary to have the set of use cases ready to go into committee review. Although we're also trying to, as Adam also discussed, is feed them to the committees over time, so that we're not going to wait till October and dump 10 use cases on you and say, oh, could you review these for us by tomorrow? You know, we want to start giving them to you so you can start looking at them. Once we're done with them, you know, we'll have a process to hand them off to the committees. So be aware that those are going to be coming to you, because I know that all of you have full agendas as it is with work that you're trying to do, and between the use cases we're asking you to review and the terminology that we're asking you to review, that's just some extra time in your weekly agendas. Hopefully you're doing a lot of that electronically. So next steps, we want to update the use case lifecycle criteria and template based on the feedback we get. We do have a formal process for that. And anyway, help us out with that. We want to continue to progress towards the 2013 goal of a published set of use cases and continue use case collection via the wiki. I do have a couple parting solicitations. Again, the use case development effort is an ongoing activity, and so we'd like you to consider, you know, as a group and as individuals, how you may be able to help us by contributing additional use cases, by reviewing and commenting on the existing use cases, and considering the use cases when you're developing your own work products. And if you want to be more involved, please, by all means, join us in the ad hoc group. We meet weekly Wednesdays at 4 p.m. Also, we have a new campaign that we're on, which is Adopt a Use Case. As I mentioned, there's some use cases out there that are nothing more than headers, or, you know, are very sketchily filled in right now. Go out there and find one and let it lick your face. So we could use some help filling out those use cases. And last but not least, just a reminder, please review and comment on the 3 things that were sent out recently. We're hoping you'll give us some good feedback, and we're looking forward to seeing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. You don't get stepped down yet. Peter, I think, has the first comment. If y'all could raise your hands if you also have a question. I just want to recognize a few. Okay, I've got 2 more, and I think that's all we'll take in order to stay on schedule. So, Peter first.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi.
One question, one comment. The question, and it links a bit back to Adam's presentation, to what extent are you trying to ensure that the language used in the use cases aligns with the definitions we're coming up with? Because I think that's an important consideration. I see Scott bouncing up and down right next to me, so he's always going to answer.
Do you want to make your comment first?
Just the comment is, the one thing I'm wondering again about whether we're over-engineering is, are the use cases intended to be are they policy products of IDESG, or are they just formalized statements of what is in terms of certain problems that are being addressed, and serve rather as input to the policy development process? And therefore, I'm just wondering whether, if we burden things too much by saying we've got to approve by plenary an individual use case and have the debates around that, what actual value are we adding to the overall process, rather than just saying, okay, that's a well-worked-out use case. We've been through a sort of quality assessment. The language is right. It lines up. It's clearly not off the wall. It's something which is very real. Does it really need to be approved by plenary? That's just my comment.
Okay, thank you.
It is a sort of question, I suppose. But
if you'll hand the mic to Scott, he'll answer your first question, and then I'll think of an answer to the second one.
Okay. So there was a bullet about trying to keep the terminology consistent, but however, it is a moving target, and it's moving rapidly enough that it's really probably something we're going to have to come back and revisit. You know, the taxonomy group has made some progress, but it's 5 terms, so it will continue to evolve. And just as a prequel to Kathy's response, I think we've already identified that the use cases will be good in validating the functional model and the completeness thereof, and I'm sure there are other good uses for it. But back to you, Kathy.
Okay, thanks. You know, actually, Peter, until you mentioned that during Adam's presentation, I didn't think we had an option of doing anything but having plenary approval, because I thought this was a formal work product and that it was required to go through a plenary approval process. Certainly it's not a policy document. I guess the question in my mind is buy-in from the group. And so if we were able to get buy-in without going through the formal process, certainly that would be a time-saving effort. What I wouldn't want to be in the position of is not going through a plenary approval process and then having ongoing and continuous criticism for what's out there. You know what I mean? So.
Hi, it's Andrew Hughes. Could you go back to the slide with Bob's 2013 goals?
Yep.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay. There you go.
This is a great list. It also matches up very well with the work planning discussion we're having in the Trust Framework and Trustmark Committee yesterday and today. It's about requirements for framing up the ecosystem in the framework. What are the parameters? We're discussing what kinds of questions we would ask of applicants to the ecosystem framework and the ecosystem itself. So a lot of these are identical to what we're talking about. So it's a good sign.
Oh, thank you. Bob, thanks you.
Yes, yeah, Bob, thanks you. Judith, I think you get the last question.
He just stole my thunder. So I was going to ask for this slide back up as well, because the main thing in reviewing the selected set that I've been asking is, what are they going to be used for? And I think this outlines what they're going to be used for, which is multiple things against which the IDESG can look to those, but not necessarily the complete set. So I think in sending things out to the committees, making sure this list that hasn't been prevalent much lately before be present.
Thank you.
So, by the way, I should give credit where credit is due. I sent this note out, but it was based on Kathy's work clarifying the goals of the objective over the past couple of committee meetings. So any excellence that attaches to this should be attributed mostly to Kathy rather than to me.
I think we're done.
Okay, thanks very much. So next we have the Policy Coordination Committee report. Dan Chenuk and Jeremy Grant are going to be giving this report. Then we'll have a pilot project presentation, and then we will have the coffee break. So Dan and Jeremy, take it away. Thank you, okay. Kathy.
So can we switch?
Let's have a round of applause for Kathy.
Absolutely. All right. So thanks, everybody. So as most of you heard yesterday, Jeremy gave a very articulate discussion of the opportunity in policy. And for those of you that weren't here, I think wanted to just sort of briefly recap before I launch in. Do you want to take 30 seconds? 2 minutes. Yeah.
Well, I realize I'm standing
but
between.
Half of these people have heard it already. So.
Sure. Well, just to recap, what I talked about yesterday a little bit is NSTIC is a strategy. It's not legislation. It's not regulation. It's a strategy that basically calls on everybody in the country to essentially change the way that they do security and privacy online for the better so that the whole country can benefit. Being a strategy, it's basically counting on a lot of companies and other organizations to do all of this because we're asking them to, which it's certainly become clear from conversations with many of you and others that sometimes the government needs to do other things to basically put a policy foundation in place of incentives to actually drive change and serve as a foundation for the kind of ecosystem that we're looking to create in the strategy rather than simply ask everybody to do the right thing. To that end, NSIC, while it doesn't actually call specifically for new legislation or regulation, does specifically anticipate that some of it might be needed, and in fact asks the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, which it envisioned being set up, to identify whether any changes to law might be needed on things, for example, like liability of identity transactions, in order to provide the right foundation. And I will say from the start, we actually did not count on legislation being something that was going to solve all problems, and it still may not be. But what's interesting right now in Washington, just to recap from yesterday, is there's a broader debate right now around cybersecurity incentives, because there are other efforts outside of NSTIC, most notably the President's executive order, focusing on voluntary efforts to essentially improve the state of cybersecurity. And with this, the Hill and the administration are very focused on what incentives might actually be needed or helpful in this regard. Just yesterday, the Senate Commerce Committee introduced a new cybersecurity bill, which, if passed, would both codify the role that NIST is playing under the cybersecurity executive order into law, and the committee's basically said that while the initial draft doesn't include incentives, they've sent signals that it's one of the issues they'll be looking at as they hold hearings in the weeks to come. So with this, there's a very interesting window that's open that I would say was probably not on anybody's agenda a year ago, and things being on the agenda in Washington, particularly in the legislative calendar, are very important. It's probably the most important thing in terms of whether you have an opportunity to do anything at all. Dan Chenuk is chairing the Policy Coordinating Committee, and is going to talk a little bit more about some of the work that we've asked he and the IDESG to conduct on this topic. So, thanks.
So thanks again. And yes, I'm the chair. We are the committee without a vice chair. Everybody on the committee is a vice chair. So if you want to join our committee, you could be a vice chair too. Thanks to actually, in all candor, to the members of the committee who helped get us to this point. As Jeremy said, there is a window open now, and we want to try to get some information that helps us present to you all at a future meeting some ideas for recommendations we can make to DHS, to NIST, to the government around not just legislation, but potentially regulation, administrative guidance, et cetera, that would help incentivize companies to participate in the IDESG. For the most part, companies that are still sort of looking in from the outside. There's an ongoing discussion, and Kim and I have been talking as well, that we all have been talking about here over the last couple of days around bringing value to the plenary through, in terms of communications to companies that are currently in the plenary. This is obviously key to the sustainability of the business model. What we're trying to do is identify some policy initiatives that really focus on some specific and tangible value. And I'll talk through pretty quickly a set of slides that kind of set it up and spend most of the 15, 20 minutes we have talking about the last slide. And I should stay to the microphone as opposed to walking around like a talk show host. So basically, the idea also is that this is not all or nothing. It's not you have to have a law that says every company in the country has to participate or some version thereof, nor is it simply just saying that if you join the IDESG, there's a policy that you'll get more information. You'll see a spectrum of policy initiatives and options on the last slide that I'll talk through. And the idea is to talk to companies about what would make sense to them, what they would see as the greatest value, and also have a conversation here with the various discussions going around the trust framework model and the business model about, should all policies be applicable to all members, or should there be basically a cascading effect of if you are a basic member, you might have one set of policies. If you participate as a full trust mark provider, et cetera, you might have another. So we'll come back to that. So Jeremy talked about this window. The idea that we have is to kind of take advantage of the window and get a little bit out in front of the discussions that we're talking about in terms of getting input from companies, talk to a small group informally about what they would see as value from policy incentives that they could have. We would then, as a policy committee, go back to the communications committee and the business model committee and say, here's what we're hearing in terms of these specific areas of policy value. And then we'd work together with those committees to basically put together a report back to the plenary about recommendations that we might bring through the National Program Office to the government for how to move forward. We've been talking about how to interest companies, especially companies that are not yet part of this group. And so we're basically going to send out a communication to this small group that we'd want to talk to that would have some of the basic information that you all know very well, but just to remind them of the importance of the industry in terms of the use on the internet. The Boston Consulting Group study that I'm sure many of you are familiar with had some data here, and restating the goals of the NSTIC that I won't read through here, but just to get them sort of understanding what the basic market space is that we're looking to operate in. Remind these entities that this is a private sector-led initiative, not a government regulatory initiative, that it established this group as the leadership body, and that it needs active participation by a good cross-section of companies, not just in the core identity industry, but companies that are across all different spaces of the commercial sector and the government sector that rely on the work that goes on by groups like ours. So the basic questions that we're going to ask are not that different from the questions that Kim talked about, but they really focus in on sort of what are the policy issues, again, so that we can ride the window that Jeremy talked about. Are there specific policy recommendations that we might make to DHS, for example, as part of the work coming out of the incentives work that they're doing under the Cybersecurity Executive Order, which some of you may be following? So are there specific policy initiatives that could transform how digital identities are used and how online identities are used in a way that would interest your organization to join the IDESG? What kinds of incentives would be associated with those issues that would be attractive? And then to the value point, how would those incentives bring value not just to you as a company, but also to the consumers and citizens and individuals and trading partners that you do business with? And again, this would be done in coordination with the business model discussion. So that's sort of the broad overview. I'll now spend a few minutes on sort of the taxonomy of policy initiatives that we've talked about within the committee and a little bit with the program office. And again, this is an illustrative list. It varies from sort of easy to do and basic to something would probably be a lot harder and take a lot more time, which would be, let's say, full liability protection, as Jeremy talked about, would require statutory change. And again, this could vary. If you could imagine that if you join the IDESG as a basic member, you would get access to information. If you get accredited, you might get 2 or 3 of these, to the extent that we come up with a list that's workable across the plenary. If you become a full Trustmark provider, et cetera, once that process is in place, you might get a larger range. So we'll talk with you over time about what that process might look like. The basic points of value that we've been talking about are first, information value. Basically, for example, we might create a clearinghouse of information on identity risks. And if you're a member of the IDSG, you get easy access to that clearinghouse that can help you on a day-to-day basis as you interact with citizens and consumers and providers. You might think about the government making it a little easier for members of the IDSG to sell to the government. If you, for example, GSA has a number of programs about selling to the government, and there might be an activity with GSA where they identify a path for members of the IDSG to come in under a schedule, for example, or have certain terms and conditions that are pre-approved. There might be any number of procurement activities that might make it a little easier. There are a lot of activities that we go through as companies, and I was in the government for a long time, so I often created the burden, and now I'm in the private sector, so I'm on the other end receiving the burden, that if they were lowered, especially for companies that have demonstrated good practice, have demonstrated responsible activity under the IDSG in various ways, could be reduced. You could have, if you basically a policy that says if you meet a certain level, we will only audit you on a less frequent scale as an agency, because we'll assume that you are in good standing and doing good work over time. Another that was added in discussion in the committee was basically identifying a market scan for members, creating new paths and identifying new markets for customers. You might think about regulatory impacts. A lot of us are in companies or are parts of agencies that are part of a regulatory process that basically establish rules and talk about how to comply with those rules. There are self-regulatory alternatives, and we might identify particular self-regulatory alternatives from regulated industries that would serve to take down the burden of regulation in that sense. Similarly, the FTC has a number of programs where companies that demonstrate responsible action can basically have a reduced burden in terms of FTC activity, and that might be something that we'd want to look at further. Tax incentives, we might think about a policy that talks about that. That would obviously be on the end of the scale that would take a lot of doing, take some legislative change, but certainly it's one that we wanted to put on the table to see what kind of value companies would see from that. And then finally, as Jeremy said, sort of legal safeguards, liability protection of the kind that is being discussed in the cybersecurity arena right now, to basically say, all right, if you have a liability protection in terms of participating with the government by providing information around cybersecurity risks, if you provide information to the government as a responsible actor in the IDESG, perhaps there's some sort of liability protection that could be provided as well. Again, this is an illustrative list. When we talk to companies, the idea would not be to say, you know, what do you think of these, and then walk away. The idea would also be to stimulate a conversation, come up with other ideas that we can come back, talk with the business model group, then report back to the plenary about how best to move forward. So we've been asked to give you an update on this project, and we're welcoming any questions. We will be meeting as a committee at 3:45 to talk further about how to proceed from here, but I know we have a few minutes, Bob, for questions, so I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We have 9 minutes for questions.
Dan, just out of curiosity, since we had a brief discussion this morning in one of the sessions, is there any thought, in addition to going to specific companies, given the legislative process and the number of trade associations that have been active participants in the process up to now, of doing an interview with one or two of those association executives about where they're going with policy and how we can align with that or leverage the activities that they've done so far to answer those questions?
Sure. So we have a sort of a tentative starting list because we figured we should just get started and not wait for a big process, because again, this is sort of informal advanced thinking that we're trying to get back. I think that's a good suggestion. We hadn't thought about going to a trade association. And the one thing I'd want to make sure is that they didn't think that this was more than it is, just sort of an initial scoping exercise. But I think that if framed in the right way, especially working with some associations that are comfortable with the process, I think, Jim, that's a good suggestion, so I'll take that note.
Are there other questions for Dan or, for that matter, for Jeremy? Apparently there are not. Thanks very much, Dan.
Okay. Thank you.
So now we have another invited presentation. This is a presentation about the UCAID pilot project. We're going to have Mike Grady from UCAID to kick it off, and then he will introduce Jeff Schiller and David Laporte from MIT.
Does change, or do I do something up here?
We'll pause for a moment while we're swapping slides.
Oh, there. Okay, gotcha. Oh, I see. So now,
oh, you need to do this right and left.
Right and left. Okay.
The computer you're controlling is right back on that table.
Okay.
That helps. And if it doesn't work, tell us and we'll
There.
get it for you.
Okay, thanks. I'm Mike Grady. I'm here representing the Internet 2, which is UCAID is the legal name of Internet 2, but it's the Internet 2 Scalable Privacy Project. It's one of 5 of the initial pilots funded under the NSTIC effort. And there's a number of thrusts in the project. Today we're going to report on some of the MFA work. We're going to take advantage of the hosting here by MIT. One of the funded efforts in MFA multi-factor authentication deployment is here at MIT. So after I talk a little bit about what our MFA consortium activities are currently. We're going to get a report on what MIT is currently doing with MFA deployment and what they've already done and what they're planning to do from a couple of the folks leading that effort here at MIT. So I'll start with a reminder of what we did report at the last plenary meeting on all of the aspects of the project, but I'll give a brief reminder of what the MFA consortium is, and then go over some of the issues that have already come up that we're planning to deal with, and some of the things that we're hoping to learn over the next 6 months to a year. So the consortium is roughly 40 institutions, higher ed space, and some vendors. And we're welcoming vendor participation also under sort of a set of ground rules to advance the state of deployment of multi-factor authentication in higher ed. And the end result being, as Ken likes to say, that we will have advanced the needle of MFA deployment at each of these institutions, and at the same time create a set of resources that lower the perceived barriers to any institution deploying multi-factor authentication. So one of the artifacts of the project will hopefully be a website with lots of resources, sample business plans, deployment plans, FAQs, user support documents, return on investment analyses, any and all of the above that will then be a lasting resource for other institutions that come to this after the active work of the consortium. So one of the first things that has come up is a variety of issues, some of these which will be particular to higher ed, some of which will be broadly applicable to any MFA deployment. And again, we're imagining we could end up creating a matrix that lists the issues and which MFA technologies or vendors these might apply to, and strategies to mitigate those concerns, or say have an alternate solution. So the range of those issues so far: accessibility support. So higher ed has been particularly concerned with accessibility support, and we need to understand the range of new issues that come up when we have multi-factor authentication devices, tokens, mobile phone approaches. What new issues come up, and what do we need to do to mitigate or solve those issues? So whether it's probably some range of alternate approaches, perhaps some change in some of the user interfaces. The key thing is to identify what the issues are, and then have a range of solutions to those issues. FERPA, so that's an area which is particular to education, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And this has already come up with one of our pilot deployment institutions, which they were looking at an outsourced MFA solution and looking at the contract language and saying, this isn't sufficient for us to be comfortable putting MFA in front of a service and requiring it, because then students would be needing to share their cell phone numbers and we wouldn't give them an option around that. And that would be personally identifiable information, and if the student wanted to exercise their FERPA rights, they wouldn't be able to do that. Those kinds of problems likely can be solved with the appropriate contract language. So, again, that could be another artifact that the project produces, would be what is the contract language we need there, so that every institution's a little bit different. Legal counsel and registrars at different institutions interpret what they are or aren't required to do under FERPA a little bit differently. Who qualifies as a school official and who doesn't. But the hope is that we can come up with several examples. We can come up with sufficient language that can satisfy that and remove that issue off the table. Cloud authenticators and high availability. So if we require MFA in front of our services and that second factor is in a cloud service and the user can't get to that cloud service at the moment they need to authenticate, what's our fallback strategy? What happens then? Are we ready? And of course, this is an issue for anyone, right? Are we ready to rely on those cloud services for something as core as authentication? Failover strategies, and this is actually one which has started a great discussion now within the consortium. As not surprising, it's often easier if you bring a specific question to a group to get active engagement than if you just sort of say, okay, what do you want to talk about? So you're relying on a mobile, you've registered your phone to be your multi-factor authenticator, and now you've left it at home, or it's broken, or it's lost. Now what do I do if I want to get into a service? What are my failover strategies if I've deployed MFA? So we are forming a set of subgroups within the consortium to tackle various business plans, technology issues. So we're going to have a group focus on coming up with a white paper around, okay, here's the things that could go wrong, and here are the strategies to mitigate that. Whether it is having alternate phone numbers, and of course it's also dependent on your deployment model. So some higher ed institutions are starting with MFA deployments similar to Google and others, which it's an opt-in model. Any user will be able to choose, hey, for my authentications, I want to be required to do MFA. So if you've got a user opt-in model, that may increase the range of failover strategies. At least one institution several institutions are talking about, you could pre-designate friends who have the authority to opt you back out if you suddenly can't do MFA. Now, on the other hand, if it's a service that requires MFA, you don't want to have a failover strategy that isn't okay with the service itself. So that may change the range of failover services that you would consider. Now, we, in higher ed, of course, we have an active trust framework of in common, and we think we're going to get the biggest return on investment with multi-factor authentication by putting support into Shibboleth, which many of us are using for the support of SAML, and CAS, which is another very popular SSO in higher ed. But how do we measure and document that return on investment? Again, to help convince institutions that, this is worth expending, what's the cost and what's my return on it? So I know with all the different ways I could be spending my money, this is one of the ways I really should be doing it. And then we want to establish effective deployment strategies, where, as I say, some institutions are going to start with an opt-in model, others are going to do a risk assessment of various services and say, hey, this person has elevated privileges in our ERP system, and therefore we're going to require them to do MFA. As I say, we'd hope to produce a variety of white papers on accessibility analyses of approaches, failover strategies, and then an analysis. There's the project also helping to fund work to make putting in a variety of MFA technologies into Shibboleth and CAS much easier. And then we want to do an analysis of, well, was that effective, and how easy is it now to actually integrate a given MFA technology into one of those single sign-on and federated frameworks. And then there's another tool that makes management of end-user certificates much easier, and we want to see what effect that does or doesn't have in terms of the use of certificates. Does PKI deployed to users actually start to really happen? few other things would be, are there new roles, any new positions or change in responsibilities that we need to create in a higher ed institution to support MFA? And probably many things, hopefully we'll learn many things we didn't already know that we needed to learn. And now, we're hoping, is Jeff Schiller and David here? Oh, okay. The two folks now at MIT who are leading the MFA deployment at MIT are going to talk about that work. And then I'd suggest perhaps, if it's okay with everyone, that we wait for any questions till after they've had a chance to talk.
Look on the table for your AV hookup.
I'm missing the. Oh, there we go.
The dongle. All right. Yeah, while Dave gets, I'm Jeff Schiller. This is David Laporte. David's relatively new to MIT. You've been here how long?
8 months.
And I've been at MIT, 36, 37 years. So, I don't know, maybe if you even average us, we're doing okay. So at MIT, we've actually been in the security business for quite a while. We deployed public key certificates for client authentication in 1996. We've issued literally millions of certificates, most of which, of course, are expired. And we started dabbling with multi-factor authentication, I think around 2009, using the RSA Secure ID tokens. And we primarily use that for access to privileged services. So if you wanted to do a root login on one of our database servers in our data center, you had to have one of these RSA Secure ID tokens. We learned a lot about them, by the way. We know what they look like when they've been sitting in a snowbank for a few months. We know what they look like when they're run over by a truck. They claim to be very robust, and they're actually pretty they're pretty good, but they're not that good. Interestingly enough, the one that was run over by a truck still looked like a multi-factor authentication token. It just displayed numbers that were from a number set I'd never seen before. Anyhow, as we get these slides up here, they're coming. Well, I'll start talking about them anyway. There we go. At least it's on his machine, and we're going to mirror out. Dun, da, da. Yeah, okay, push that button. Yes. I love the technology. So anyhow, as part of this Internet 2 thing, we are switching over to using, go ahead, go to the first slide. Dun, da, da. We only have 2 slides, and then we're going to do a demo, so it's not that bad. So anyhow, our deployment, which we originally used with the Secure ID tokens, had a couple of problems. One is it's a physical token that everybody had to get, and these things are not cheap. Now, today, with the technology we're using today, we actually have 2 different advantages. One is it's cost effective, so we don't have to look at spending a lot of money. And it's based on the mobile phone, because everybody has a mobile phone. At least here, everybody has a mobile phone. And the other interesting thing about mobile phones is people don't tend to leave them home. They tend to always have them. And so we're looking to expand our existing, MFA environment out a little, more broadly, and change the technology from the Secure ID tokens to the Duo security tokens, which at some level are very similar in terms of their technology. And so what we proposed to the Internet 2 to do was to actually integrate multi-factor with our Touchstone single sign-on solution, which was actually sort of interesting because so Touchstone is an implementation of Shibboleth. So if you know what Shibboleth is, that's what this is. And when I first saw Touchstone, I was actually opposed to it. And I was opposed to it because we had a deployed authentication infrastructure based on client certificates. And Touchstone, guess what? It was back to usernames and passwords. And although security is a negative deliverable, you don't know when you have it, you only know when you've lost it. It's hard to say, did we have fewer breaches than we would have had we only had username and passwords? In other words, did certificates actually buy us anything? And of course the answer is it's hard for us to tell because we can't count the number of security breaches that we did not have. But I was a little bit concerned that by going to Touchstone, although it supported federated identity, it also in some ways was backing off from certificates. Now, I will say that our implementation accepts certificates. So if you're at MIT and you have an X509 client certificate in your browser, you can use that to authenticate to Touchstone. But you can also use a username and password. But then, as time would go by, I would have a change of heart, because one of the big problems with implementing multi-factor authentication is you have to basically implement it at every authentication point. So if every one of our applications that needed secure access required its own multi-factor login, well, life would get really uncomfortable very quickly. I mean, one of the keys to Google's use of multi-factor authentication is they minimize the pain by allowing you to store a cookie on your browser. So if you're not familiar with Google's two-factor implementation, when you use it, it basically has a little tick box that says, check this box to trust this computer for the next 30 days. And in fact, recently, they now have one to trust this computer forever. And yes, you can revoke that trust. But the idea is to remove the hassle factor from the user so they don't have to always have it in their face. I rarely have to use my Google multi-factor authentication token when I use my own laptop. I do have to use it if I use a different machine. So similarly, if we implement the multi-factor authentication in Touchstone, which is a single sign-on solution, then we can reduce the headache to the consumers, to our users, by saying, okay, so once a day when you log in and authenticate to Touchstone, you're going to use your MFA token, and then you can go anywhere that Touchstone is accepted and be able to log in. And for a long time, we viewed our certificates as a form of two-factor, because you had to have the certificate and you had to know the password to unlock it. So you had to have the machine the certificate was on. But ultimately, anybody with a username and password at MIT can obtain a certificate, because the website that gives out certificates obviously doesn't require a certificate. And so in some ways, the way certificates protected us is we were different. We were different than other sites, and just being different provides you a level of protection. And that difference was becoming less, and of course the attackers we were dealing with were becoming more sophisticated. So I was a big fan of, yes, we need real multi-factor, and Touchstone is a great way to get there. So I suddenly became a believer. And so part of our proposal is to incorporate the multi-factor into Touchstone and do an opt-in. So at first we're not going to say to everybody, okay, everybody, you must use MFA to get your Touchstone credentials. No, we're going to put it out there, much like Google did, and say, hey, if you care about the privacy of your information and your security, you might want to think about doing this. And what's interesting, of course, is we haven't deployed it yet, so we don't know. As some of you may know, we've been under attack recently because of various issues. Our network was attacked. We have some people that were attacked. And I'm not talking about the bombing. I'm talking about the Aaron Schwartz situation, where we have annoyed some folks. And so we become under attack. And so what we don't know is whether that will have an impact in terms of people being more security conscious. And we don't know because we can't do a before and after comparison. So anyhow, we've deployed the Duo security tokens. We don't have them in Touchstone yet. That is a work in progress. We have integrated them into our VPN solution. And for certain individuals who have access to sensitive information, they use that with the VPN. And we've also integrated it as a pre-authentication technology to Kerberos. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, Kerberos, of course, is the MIT-developed network authentication system. It's for client-server systems. It's not necessarily web-specific. And it has the ability to do pre-authentication, meaning that before the various cryptographic operations occur in Kerberos, you have to do something else. And in this case, the something else is use the MFA token. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who's going to do to talk about the status and actually give you a demo.
Hello, my name's Dave Laporte. As Jeff mentioned, I've only been at MIT for, I think, about 8 months. So some of the attacks he talked about were coming to a head literally about 2 weeks after I started. So very quickly, we started to do a few things. I'm going to talk about 3 implementations here. I've got 2 on the slides. A third I may talk about if we have time. The first is our VPN integration. VPN, or Virtual Private Network, is used by various populations on the MIT campus, but very heavily used by by administrative computing folks, such as myself. So we have many tunnels, hundreds of users. Hundreds of users using these tunnels. And the first thing we did was start rolling MFA to administrative users. I'm going to show a demo of this in a little bit, but we used Duo, which is our chosen technology, to implement multi-factor. So I'm an engineer. I'm going to get in the nuts and the bolts of this. We have a Cisco ASA concentrator. Duo, one of the reasons I really like it, and this is an endorsement by no one, I just happen to really like it technically. It's in the cloud. It integrates really well. It's REST-driven, so it's all web services based. They have a radius proxy, which means anything that speaks radius, which is a very common protocol, and especially in the network device space. You can front-end your back-end authentication store, whether it's an LDAP server or an Active Directory domain controller. You can put their radius proxy in the way, and it will kind of transparently handle the multi-factor for you. So they have on their website that it takes 5 minutes to install it and get it running. It's not far off the mark. It's actually very simple. So getting the VPN integration done was a train ride home and some tying up the loose ends afterwards. So the populations we're dealing with, as I mentioned, right now are just administrative users. There's about 250 devices, about 150 users of those devices. Kerberos, along the same lines, it's for administrative users currently. So many of us in the IT space have root principals or some principals with elevated privileges. We use Duo to authenticate ourselves using the pre-authentication method that Jeff talked about. And I'm going to do a demo of that as well. So one thing I'm not as familiar with is our development on the Touchstone piece. I am fairly new. I know we have active developers actively working on it. So this is what I'm really excited about, because this is going to be the single touch point where we can leverage multi-factor to the entire community. I'm a user of Touchstone, and coming from another organization that isn't quite so far along on the authentication as we are here at MIT, Touchstone is excellent, and I'm really looking forward to that sort of integration. So how do I do this? Hello? Okay. So now for the demo. I'll show two quick demos. One is the VPN. The other is the Kerberos. Again, this currently doesn't apply to the general population. It applies to administrative users and those users of Kerberos that have elevated principals. So, sorry, didn't get a lot of prep time. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are using Cisco's ASA VPN concentrator. We're using the AnyConnect client. It's an SSL-based client. And basically what you're not going to see here, what's happened already, is that at some point I was deemed to be in scope of this multi-factor deployment. And I've visited an administrator, and he or she has gone into the Duo security portal and created an account. That person's typically me or a small number of others. And what happens is you create the account, and the final step is it brings up two links. One is an installation link. One is an activation link. So Duo is supported on iPhones. It's supported on Android, BlackBerry. They support third-party dongles like YubiKey. They've got their own branded dongles. So it's really flexible. They'll also take S-key types lists of one-time passwords. Really, it does it all. So I'm looking forward to when we can actually automate all of this, because there is a REST-based API. We can do this with machines rather than people. But currently, it's myself or someone else logging into a website, creating an account, mapping the device to the user, and they get SMS to links. So they click the first link. Depending on what platform they're on, they're going to get directed to an app store. They install the app. The second link is the activation link. So they click that. It goes to a link at the Duo site that's customized for them with a hash in the URL, downloads it, and activates it. It's really neat. It's got your company logo. You can customize it. The other neat thing about the Duo app is that it supports any high Hot-P or Mop-P provider. So Google Authenticator, Dropbox, they all work with inside one app. So once your device is configured and mapped to your identity, it's as simple as, well, assuming somebody's done the back-end work of setting it all up, I just connect to my VPN as usual. And in this particular installation and integration, it prompts me for a second password. So I'll enter my first password. My second password can be a few things. It can be the letters SMS, in which case it's going to SMS me out of band a code. It can be the code displayed on the app. You can't really see it, but there's a 6-digit code like we're all familiar with if we used RSA or other providers. So I could type that code directly. And the thing that's really been a hit here, it's definitely a lesson learned, is this thing they call push. And this is kind of a Duo-specific thing. But if I type the word push, my login hangs. But what you'll see here is I just got a push notification. And this works on iPhones or Android. And if I view it, I realize this is really far away. But there's a nice green button and a red button. If I want to allow it, I hit the green button. If I want to deny it, I hit the red button. And it'll ask me, why are you denying it? Is it just a mistake, or is this malicious? So assuming I say yes, I hit the green button. And my login immediately proceeds. And I accept our particular AUP, and it lets me in. So that's one specific integration example. Another is Kerberos. I'm just going to set this down. So we've developed some custom integrations with the Kerberos source to allow for this integration. I believe we may be releasing those in the future. I'm simply a user of them. I didn't code this up. So I'm going to k-init, which in Kerberos land is to actually get my keys. And I'm going to my root principal, which is an elevated principal. I'm going to type my password. I think I didn't mistype that. So here we get prompted for how do we want to authenticate. If we hit enter, whoa, I typed it wrong. My mistake. If we type enter, if I hit enter, you can see the different varieties of ways that I can do my dual authentication. I can do a push to that phone number, which will send it here. I can do a push to my home tablet. I can do a phone call to this where it'll actually talk to me. I can send an SMS code. I'm going to do a push again. So I hit 1. And I get my prompt. I approve it. And in this particular case, it doesn't automatically proceed. I have to just hit enter. And I've authenticated. You've got to trust me. It's not very exciting from a command line. That just did something really good. Okay, so yeah, if I do a K-list, it's going to show my tickets. And you can see I've got tickets there, and my principal is dlaporte/root. So when I came in, we were using RSA. It was working fine, but given the grant and some of the flexibility that the API in particular and the push methods give us, we've completely supplanted that RSA deployment. So we are where we were. We've also deployed two-factor to all of our network devices. So all of our Cisco routers and switches and core components now have two-factor, as well as some of our networking-specific applications that we're using, our DNS servers and things like that. And with that, I think we have about 5 minutes for questions. So I'll stop there. If there's any questions for Mike, Jeff, or I.
Okay, questions, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I see we have at least one. The rest of you, please put your hands up in the air so that I can get you in the queue so that we can proceed efficiently.
Thank you. This is Jim. Just to start, I've seen you've mentioned what you need to do for FERPA, but given the mix of your institutions and MIT, are you looking at any specific HIPAA high-tech considerations that have to be rolled into this project as well?
Jeff, you have anything you want to say for MIT on that? I'm sure that, so HIPAA hasn't come up yet, not because it's not going to be incredibly important. It's just that, the consortium isn't there yet in terms of those specific, getting into health records and that. But I'm sure it will come up. Was there more? I mean, other than the fact that I'm sure it will be a topic that we'll be discussing. I guess there's not much more for me to say about that yet. It is interesting that no one's brought that up yet, but I think we're all in the early stages of considering MFA deployments, and when we flesh out the use cases and the business cases, that topic will be there.
Yeah, now I will preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer, but I actually believe that HIPAA is less of a concern than FERPA, because HIPAA is really focused around medical records, whereas FERPA is about student records, but student records is super broad. It's like basically everything except what we call directory data, which each institution gets to define directory data within a certain list. And so the concern is with the student phone numbers. If I have to use my cell phone as my second factor, and Duo Security as a third-party vendor needs to know that and therefore learns the association of my name to my cell phone number, technically, if the university has not defined that cell phone number, the student cell phone numbers are quote-unquote directory data, which most don't, then in theory it comes under the FERPA umbrella. I don't think we have that problem with HIPAA, because HIPAA's focus isn't on that kind of stuff. But again, I'm not the attorney here. From MIT's perspective, we have not worried about the concerns with FERPA over the phone numbers, because we actually just don't think it's an issue. I mean, if we thought the vendors were also then going to use that information to market things to our students, then it would become a very real concern. But most companies that are in the business of doing authentication technology like Duo Security or RSA or any of those guys, they know that that's information they can't turn around and then market with. I'm also familiar with this from another perspective, because we have the similar issue with emergency notification. Due to the Clery Act, every school on the planet now has to have a way of notifying students and staff if there's a bad event on campus, the active shooter, which of course we had a fake and a real one here within the last year. And so we have a thing we call MIT Alert, where we have people have to register their cell phones so they can get a text message that tells them to run and hide.
Yeah, Jeff's right. So I'm sure HIPAA will come up, as a use case for one of those areas where you really want to be getting multi-factor authentication, if you don't already have it, out there for those who have access to that data. Whereas, as Jeff points out, FERPA is an issue just potentially for some institutions with sharing information, but Jeff also illustrates the fact that that's not going to be an issue at every institution, because the way institutions have already defined who they consider to be school officials, and it may already not, the contract may already be sufficient with the different MFA vendors. But we know of at least one large example where that wasn't the case.
Hi, it's Andrew Hughes. Just wondering, what was your deployment velocity for the touchstone devices? Like, how many devices did you decommission, and then how fast and how many did you roll out?
Well, Touchstone isn't a device as much as it's a website. So it's a single sign-on website. So at MIT, if you want to log into some of our websites that are Touchstone moderated, what happens is it redirects you to Touchstone. You give your credentials, whether it's username and password or certificate, through Touchstone, and then you get redirected back to the site in question. And so right now, just about everybody at MIT uses it, because just about everybody at MIT needs to use some application that is authenticated through that pattern.
Hi, Kathy Tilton. I have a question about your applications. It sounds like most of the applications you described are internal. Do you intend to use this external through the In-Common Federation with external service providers? And if so, I assume if so, maybe that's where the shibboleth comes in. But have you had any relying parties or service providers requesting multi-factor?
I'll answer the last part first. No. Our plan is, like I said, to make this as an opt-in for individuals to provide additional protection over their own information. Now, what I'm about to say is not MIT policy. I'm about to give you Jeff's view of the world. My view is we have to make this work. We have to make this as easy and as seamless as possible to use. If we are successful, and if I were king, I would then turn around and say, guess what? If you have access to other people's personal information, then we will make it required. We also, MIT sort of does this today because we do require the MFA for access to certain servers. But if I were king, I would make it be policy that, and this would mostly apply to staff, so FERPA doesn't really come into play here because this is a staff issue, not a student issue. But to say that if in the course of doing your job you need to access a site that gives you access to other people's personally identifiable information, then we're going to hold you to a higher standard and we're going to require it. But even that's, I think, an internal thing. And I expect that we'll see that internally before we'll see that externally.
So Jeremy's going to ask you a question in a minute, but Jeff, I wanted to ask you one too. So what is your view of the future of multi-factor authentication in cross-institutional scenarios? Do you think that you're ever going to require people coming in from other institutions to use MFA, or that they will require that of you?
Well, I would anticipate, I think we have to be careful what we mean by MFA, in the sense that I believe we're going to need to have an attribute within the shibboleth context called is authenticated with MFA or some equivalent language. Whether it's are you authenticated with multi-factor, or is there a sliding scale of you are authenticated at least this strong, and I can envision more than 2 levels, and I can easily see applications that say to use this application, the strength of your authentication must be level X or must include MFA. And that means that the home institution would require MFA for login. So it's not like you'd have to have a separate token to go to that external guy. You'd use your standard internal token, and you would use it the way you normally use to do your internal authentication. It's just that information, the fact that you used it, would be able to be available and could be used as a decision criteria by external sites. And I think ultimately we're going to see that. What's funny is in a lot of the conversations I've been in about strength of authentication, there's been a tremendous amount of focus on identity proofing. How do we know that these are the people who they really, really are? And my personal view for a long time has been that's not the right question. If I go to buy an airline ticket, the airline doesn't really care who I am. All they care is that they get paid. And when I get to the gate, they don't care who I am. All they care is that I have an ID that name matches what's on the ticket. They don't really care that that's the name I was born with. Now, I have a particularly interesting thing because my father, late in life, discovered that his name was not his name. That his name was, as far as he thought, was Barry, but it turns out legally he was Bernard, and he never knew that, and nobody cared. But what the question we don't ask, which was what we should be asking, is what's not the strength of the identity proofing, the strength of the authentication. How do I really know that this is, this is really Jeff and not someone who somehow managed to steal his password? And that's a much bigger risk to me than the identity proofing threats.
I just had one final question. So the way that you've run the demos, the Duo solution is basically augmenting the password to get to 2 factors. Are you looking at any applications where you might use it as a replacement for the password, simply not having to enter a password but only an email and then using the app?
I think the simple answer is no. But I think the simple answer is no because we haven't deployed it enough yet. We haven't thought about it enough yet. In my own hacking around, I run a whole pile of random web servers, including one for the Essex County rabbit and cavy breeders. On that one, I just do for a while it was just if you had the 6-digit code, that was good enough. But It's 6 in one, half dozen the other. We haven't really thought about it.
So Jeremy's wish to have one last question was optimistic. I have two more, and then after that I'll wrap it up.
I want to add one thing on that on the issue of requiring it in federated. It's already cases where, for say, research collaborations, which would be using federated authentication, where I'm sure the MFA requirement or a level of assurance where MFA will come into that will be required for researchers doing work that they don't want, a particular university's hosting the collaboration environment for that research project.
G'day, this is Scott Ray, now at DigiCert. How you doing, Jeff? I like the fact that you brought up the fact, your thing that you're interested in is, the strength of the authentication. But 800-63 talks about the strength of the authentication. It also talks about the strength of identity proofing. And then it also speaks about the strength of the management of the actual credentials or tokens themselves that are being used. And I wonder if you had anything to add in terms of, what view MFA has on that aspect, as there is sharing amongst institutions, and how an institution that might handle the way that they manage that process versus another.
There's this old saying, you don't want the perfect to become the enemy of the good. I think we're still very early in the whole deployment of what I would call enhanced authentication technology. And so we don't really know yet what really is important. I do know that there's already been concerns raised in some areas about, well, if your token is on your phone and your phone is stolen and misplaced, that happens plenty, are we concerned about that? And obviously the first answer is, well, if the phone's stolen, you deactivate the credential. That's pretty easy to do. Then the risk becomes the range of time from when the phone is stolen to when it's known to be stolen, and there's a window of vulnerability. And I will tell you this, and I really don't want to sound like the marketing department for Duo, but one of the things their token, or they claim to do, I can't independently audit this, is that on phones that have an NFC chip, the NFC chips typically are paired with a secure element, which is effectively a smart card. And they store the secrets for generating the codes in that chip. So what that means is if somebody takes my phone while I'm not looking, roots it, and dumps out all the state they can dump out, and then somehow gives it back to me and I don't notice, they still don't get those secrets, because not even the operating system has access to those secrets, because the actual token generation, the actual digit generation is done in the secure element. So, but at this point, I think if you were to say we must require all soft phone solutions to be that strong, so therefore phones that don't have a secure element don't qualify, then we're going to cut ourselves, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face, because we're going to limit the market. And what we really need to do, I think, at this stage of the game is make it as easy as possible for people to join in. And things like secure elements will solve themselves over a period of time, because, assuming NFC takes off and secure elements show up in phones, the vendors of the token applications can take advantage of it, and that's all transparent to the users. I think the big deal right now is to figure out how to get this accepted by the users so that they'll actually do it.
Okay, again, related to the strength of the authentication, it sounds like you had two multi-factor authentication scenarios, one based on one-time passwords and the other based on the PKI certificates. And some might argue that one-time passwords is not as strong as certificates, because the one-time passwords are susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack. So I'm just wondering, was that a factor at all for you, looking at the strength of the one-time passwords versus their certificates, or was that just not, was the ease of use of the one-time password just so much better that it washed out any concern about the security aspect?
No, it's kind of complicated. So indeed, some people think that having a client certificate is a second factor, because you have to have the device that the certificate is stored on. The reality is, unless that certificate is stored on a token itself, if it's stored in software on somebody's laptop, then for most scenarios, they can choose not to password protect it. So it goes from two-factor to one-factor, the one factor being, do I have possession of the token? And so, which is another argument of maybe you always want to have a password anyway, because the token may well reduce down to really, do I physically have this device? And in our case, our certificates are obtainable. If I know somebody's Kerberos name, if I know their password, and I know their MIT ID number, then I can obtain a certificate in their name. And I know of at least one situation, one circumstance where this happened, where somebody stole somebody's credentials and then was able to obtain a certificate in their name. Now, it happened to be somebody on campus and it was done for a prank. Amen. There was no harm there. But as soon as people become aware of that, then the notion that the certificate's a second factor just goes away.
So y'all don't leave till I get to go through a few logistics with you. But I'll start by thanking UCAID and MIT and Jeff and Mike and David. Thanks very much. That was a really good session. I think the questions were great, and we very much appreciate you staying here to give us that presentation. So just a few logistics here. So first, maybe Laura, you can, or somebody can put up the slide thanking our sponsor for the coffee break. This coffee break is sponsored by Troop ID. Thank you very much to Troop ID. I'm sure all of us are at about the point where coffee is necessary. Second, there is still one MIT tracking device cell phone outstanding. I'm not going to try to. If you're the possessor of that device, I'm not going to name you here, but please do turn that in. For those of you who don't have a tracking device, at the conclusion of the committee meetings this afternoon, I haven't been invited to any parties, so if there is one, I don't know about it, and y'all will be punished later if there is. Since you don't have the tracking device, you can just slink out straight to whatever dens of iniquity you have planned following the conclusion of your committee meetings. Unless you are a chair, in which case the news is less good. The chairs will once again meet to do a wrap-up of today in coordination for tomorrow at 6 p.m. We will try to limit that to no more than an hour so that any drinking arrangements you might have won't be interfered with. Finally, tomorrow morning we will start at 8:30 a.m. again. I will try to work with the management of the Marriott to get the fire alarm to go off half an hour earlier so that it doubles as an alarm. But please do try to be here on time at 8:30. So I will now release you to the break and to your committee meetings. Thanks very much to all of our presenters today, and thank you for sticking with us and all the good work.
My name is Blake Hall. I spent 15 months hunting high-value targets while leading a scout platoon in Iraq.
My name is Matthew Thompson. I led Army Rangers on multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Today, we're the founders of Troop ID,
a technology company that employs veterans and empowers members of the military community to access benefits online.
Spike salutes Troop ID for being selected the 2013 most veteran-friendly small business in America. To find out what you can do, go to hireevent.spike.com.
My name is Blake Hall. I spent 15 months hunting high-value targets while leading a scout platoon in Iraq.
My name is Matthew Thompson. I led Army Rangers on multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan.
Today, we're the founders of Troop ID,
a technology company that employs veterans and empowers members of the military community to access benefits online.
Spike salutes Troop ID for being selected the 2013 most veteran-friendly small business in America. To find out what you can do, go to hireevent.spike.com.